He marched not as a man, but as a storm-shattering empires, leveling cities, and branding his name into the flesh of history itself. Alexander of Macedon, known as Alexander the Great, was not merely a conqueror. He was a force that redrew the boundaries of the known world through fire, blood, and relentless ambition. His victories are etched in legend, but beneath the tales of glory lies a darker chronicle of terror and ruin, buried beneath centuries of admiration. When kings aspire to divinity, mercy withers. What followed in his path was not salvation, but devastation, a legacy forged in brutality, carved into time by war. Cities leveled to ash under his command. In 335 BCE, the city of Thebes, known as one of the most powerful and storied city-states of ancient Greece, stood defiant against a rising force. Its people believed they could resist the tide of Macedonian power. They were wrong. When Alexander the Great, barely 21 years old, received word of Theban rebellion, he responded not with diplomacy, but with ruthless speed and overwhelming violence. Within days, Alexander's army descended upon Thebes, encircling it with precision and fury. The assault was swift. The city's famed walls, thought impregnable, were shattered by siege engines and relentless infantry. Thebes fell, not as a result of prolonged warfare, but in a calculated act of terror meant to crush any notion of defiance among the Greek city-states. Ancient historian Diodorus Siculus recorded that Alexander razed the city to the ground, sparing only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar. The rest was ash. Approximately 30,000 Thebans were either killed or sold into slavery. Families were torn apart, homes reduced to rubble, and Thebes, once the heart of Boeotian pride, was wiped from the political map. This act was not a necessity of war. It was a deliberate display of might. Alexander's message was clear. Resistance would be met with annihilation. Thebes became a warning etched into the conscience of Greece, a city not merely defeated, but erased to ensure that fear would succeed where rebellion had failed. Mass executions ordered after surrender. In 332 BCE, the island fortress of Tyre, known as the Jewel of Phoenicia, dared to defy Alexander. Protected by high walls and surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea, Tyre believed itself untouchable. Its refusal to submit was not just an act of resistance, it was a challenge to Alexander's authority. What followed was one of the most brutal sieges of antiquity. For 7 relentless months, Alexander's forces labored to construct a massive causeway, stretching from the mainland to the city's gates, enduring constant counterattacks and heavy losses. When the walls were finally breached, Alexander's fury was unleashed without restraint. According to the historian Quintus Curtius Rufus, roughly 6,000 Tyrian defenders were killed during the final assault. But the carnage did not end with victory. Alexander ordered that approximately 2,000 surviving men, likely prisoners of war, be executed by crucifixion along the shoreline, a grim display to any who watched from afar. Women and children, numbering around 30,000, were sold into slavery. This was not a spontaneous act of vengeance, it was a calculated punishment. Tyre's resistance had delayed Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire, and for that, the city paid the ultimate price. The massacre at Tyre was not only a devastating blow to the Phoenicians, but a message to the wider world. Surrender immediately or face utter ruin. The once mighty Tyre, known for its maritime power and independence, was reduced to silence, its people gone, its defiance crushed beneath the weight of imperial ambition. Forced march leading to countless deaths. In 325 BCE, as Alexander the Great led his army back from the farthest reaches of his conquests in India, he made a fateful decision. Instead of retracing a safer northern route, he chose to cross the Jedrosian Desert, modern-day Makran, in southern Iran and Pakistan. Known to ancient geographers as a barren, merciless expanse, the desert was infamous for its lack of water, searing heat, and treacherous terrain. Alexander's aim, according to historians like Arrian, was to surpass the feats of earlier Persian kings, particularly Cyrus the Great, who had failed to traverse this region. What unfolded was not a military campaign, but a slow-motion catastrophe. Tens of thousands of soldiers, camp followers, and pack animals perished, not in battle, but from exhaustion, dehydration, and starvation. Arrian recounts that the heat was so intense that many dropped dead where they stood. And ancient sources estimate that only a fraction of the army survived the ordeal. Supplies ran out, wells were dry or poisoned, and sandstorms engulfed entire columns. This was not an unavoidable tragedy of war, it was the direct result of Alexander's ambition and need for glory. He marched his people into a wasteland to etch his name into history, regardless of the human cost. The Gedrosian March stands as one of antiquity's most harrowing forced marches, a grueling journey that offered no strategic benefit, only death and despair. In seeking to rival legends, Alexander created one of his own, soaked not in bloodshed, but in the silent toll of lives lost to an unforgiving land. Entire populations enslaved as punishment in 332 BCE, as Alexander advanced through the Levant, the fortified city of Gaza known as a strategic gateway between Egypt and the broader Persian Empire stood directly in his path. Unlike many cities that submitted, Gaza's commander Bewis, a loyal Persian noble, refused to yield. The city's defenses, perched atop a high mound and reinforced by thick walls, turned the siege into a brutal test of will. For 2 months, Alexander's forces battered the city with siege engines, sustaining heavy casualties in repeated assaults. When Gaza finally fell, Alexander's response was ruthless and unrelenting. Ancient historian Quintus Curtius Rufus records that Battus was captured alive, and in a calculated act of cruelty, Alexander had him dragged behind a chariot around the city walls, echoing Achilles' treatment of Hector in Homeric legend. But the punishment did not stop at leadership. Gaza's entire population, men, women, and children, was condemned to slavery. Estimates suggest tens of thousands were sold into bondage, uprooted from their homes, and scattered across the Hellenic world. This was not a necessary act of war. It was a message written in chains. The enslavement of Gaza's people served as a stark deterrent to others, illustrating the price of resistance. What had been a vibrant trade center became a symbol of retribution, its populace erased from the land they had defended. In the pursuit of empire, Alexander demonstrated that mercy was conditional and defiance would be met with annihilation, not only in death but in the loss of freedom for an entire city. Cultural sites destroyed to crush resistance. In 330 BCE, Alexander the Great entered Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Known as a marvel of architecture, adorned with towering columns and intricate reliefs, Persepolis was not just a city. It was a symbol of Persian identity, power, and divine kingship. Its grand palaces and halls, particularly the famed Apadana, stood as testaments to centuries of imperial rule. Upon its capture, Alexander initially treated Persepolis with respect, allowing his men to plunder its immense wealth but sparing its structures. That restraint, however, would not last. According to the ancient historian Diodorus Siculus, during a feast marked by heavy drinking, Alexander was persuaded, possibly by the courtesan Titus, to set fire to the city's palace complex. Some sources, including Plutarch, suggest it was a deliberate act of revenge for the Persian destruction of Athens during the Greco-Persian Wars. Whether vengeance or drunken impulse, the result was devastating. Flames engulfed the heart of Persian culture, reducing temples, libraries, and centuries-old records to ash. This was more than the destruction of buildings, it was the symbolic annihilation of an empire's soul. By burning Persepolis, Alexander sought to eradicate not only the physical seat of Persian power, but also its legacy. Though later accounts debate his regret, the act remains one of the most profound examples of cultural destruction in antiquity. In his quest to forge a new world order, Alexander left behind smoldering ruins, proving that conquest was not only measured in battles won, but in civilizations erased. The Siege of Gaza and mass slaughter. As Alexander's empire expanded, one of his most brutal acts occurred in 332 BCE, when he besieged the city of Gaza, which stood as a critical stronghold between Egypt and Persia. Gaza's commander Battus refused to surrender, resulting in a relentless siege that lasted for 2 months. Despite Alexander's numerous victories, Gaza's resistance proved a test of resolve. When the city finally fell, Alexander's retribution was swift and cruel. Battus, captured alive, was dragged behind a chariot around the city walls, a punishment that mirrored the vengeance of ancient heroes. But the brutality did not end with the death of Gaza's leader. Alexander ordered the mass enslavement of the entire population. Men, women, and children were sold into slavery, their homes and livelihoods wiped away in a single act of cruelty. This punishment was not an act of military necessity, but rather a message to others: defy Alexander and face utter annihilation. Gaza, once a prosperous city, became a symbol of the destructive power Alexander wielded. Entire populations were erased, reduced to nothing more than slaves scattered across the empire. Legacy of destruction and control. Alexander's conquest was not just about land and wealth, it was about domination and control. His military genius, though unmatched, was often paired with acts of extreme cruelty that ensured his empire was maintained through fear and devastation. Cities were destroyed, cultures erased, and populations enslaved, all in the name of empire building. Alexander's legacy is one of awe and admiration, but also of terror and brutality. He reshaped the world, but at an unimaginable cost. As we reflect on Alexander's legacy, it is important to ask, what price did he pay for greatness? What cost did his empire exact, not just on those who opposed him, but on the very essence of human dignity? While his name will forever be associated with greatness, his path to that greatness was paved with destruction. And perhaps, in the end, the question we must ask is whether the world he built was worth the suffering he left in his wake.